Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hello, everybody. We're happy to have Ilan Pavlov with us today. He'll talk about characterizing double-sided auctions. Ilan is a postdoc at the Media Lab at MIT. Finished his PhD at the Hebrew University with Miki Ben-Or in 2005, and he's interested in algorithmic game theory, distributed systems, and theoretical computer science in general. So he'll be around today and tomorrow, and so if you'd like to meet him, just let him or me know about it.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about characterizing double-sided auctions. This is joint work with Mira Gonen from Tel Aviv University and Rica Gonen from Yahoo Research. So before we start, I'm going to give the results slide, and this is the take-home message. So our main result is a characterization of truthful mechanisms for double-sided auctions. So double-sided auctions are auctions with both the buyers and sellers as strategic agents, and we're going to characterize all of the possible mechanisms for these kind of auctions. And we're going to show that all truthful allocations must be affine maximizers. Along the way, we're going to define some useful concepts which we believe have more general interest, such as truthful reductions and extension of prices. So it all started back in 1979 with Roberts' theorem. So Roberts' theorem is a classic theorem in economics that characterizes social choice functions for general domains. And the theorem goes as following. If there are at least three possible outcomes, so think of it three different possibilities for allocations, and player valuations are unrestricted, so the domain is a very, very general domain, then any implementable social choice function, any means that we can have in order to choose a possible allocation, must be an affine maximizer. So it's a very strong theorem, but it makes a very strong assumption. It makes the assumption that we're looking at unrestricted domains and there's no constraints on the player's valuations. Now we know that in many domains of interest there are a lot of constraints, so we're going to look at those kind of domains too. So just some background. So everybody here is familiar with the VCG mechanism, the Vickrey-Clark-Gross mechanism. And it's a very standard mechanism used for auctioning off things. So how does it work? Given that we have n players, and each player has a valuation function for every possible allocation, we allocate the goods such as to maximize the social welfare, or the sum of the happiness of the players. And each player is charged with the opportunity cost, which is the difference between the welfare of all of the other players when he participates in the auction and the welfare when he does not participate in the auction. So it's basically the harm that this player does to other players. Now, this mechanism is known to be truthful, so players will give the correct valuation. So that means it's implementable, and as we can see, it maximizes the affine function, which is simply the sum of the valuations for the allocation chosen. Now, you can think of many different ways of extending the VCG mechanism. So here are three possible ways you can extend the VCG mechanism. One is you can restrict to some subset of allocations. So instead of looking at all possible allocations, or look at some possible allocations. Another way is you can say you have preferred players. Some players are more important that they be happy, so you can assign them weights, multiplicative weights, saying this player is going to be more important for me than other players. And the third way is you can say that some allocations or some outcomes are preferred, and you could add additive weights to those outcomes. And all three of these ways of extending the VCG mechanism will still result in an affine maximizer. So Roberts' theorem, to go back, states that for the general case in which players' valuations are unconstrained, these extensions of VCG are all of the possible implementable functions. These are all of the possible things that you can manage to achieve with truthful mechanisms, if the player's domains are unconstrained. So this raises the natural question, what happens if the player's valuations are constrained? So looking at the general case, what Roberts does is very strong. It makes a major assumption on how the player's valuations act and allows them a tremendous amount of degrees of freedom. So we can think we can constrain the players, but if we constrain them too much, it makes our life too easy. If the players are sufficiently constrained, then maybe we'll find something that's non-affine, but it might not be a very interesting case. So the question is what about questions that we're interested in? So one question that we're all interested in is combinatorial auctions. So combinatorial auctions is a problem that's been well known, well studied. The FCC spectrum auction is sort of the flagship. Anybody who talks about combinatorial auctions will mention it. And what is a combinatorial auction? There's a set of end buyers. The seller is assumed to be non-strategic, so the seller is not trying to manipulate the situation. And the seller has a set of M goods that the seller wants to sell. And each buyer has a value for subsets of the goods. And so this seems to be a relatively unrestricted domain, but there are two crucial assumptions that are made standardly for combinatorial auctions. The first assumption is free disposal, so that means you can throw things away for free. And this essentially is going to give you a monotonicity on the bundles of goods that you give players. So a player will be more happy with something that contains something else. Now obviously this is not true in general. In life, for example, if I give you some radioactive waste, you're less happy than if I would have given you with something else without the radioactive waste. And another assumption that constrains the buyer's valuations is the assumption of no externalities. So each buyer doesn't care about what the other buyers get, but only what that buyer gets. Now this is a restriction Roberts doesn't allow. Roberts says this can be general, so no externalities can exist for the valuations. So the combinatorial auction is a general thing, but we can look into even special cases of the combinatorial auction. For example, the single-minded case. The single-minded case is a very well-studied special case of the combinatorial auction in which each player only desires a single bundle, and that he has a positive value for that, and the values for all other bundles are 0. So for the single-minded combinatorial auction, then Lemon, O'Connor, and Shoreham, among others, and there's many different works that have shown mechanisms to solve to choose a possible allocation which are non-affine. And even many of these, or most of these mechanisms are also computationally efficient. I put computationally efficient in parentheses here because in this talk I really don't care about computationally efficient. We're going to be allowing ourselves to do things that are complex, that might be non-polynomial computable. That's not what's going to interest us. What's going to interest us, what are the possible choice functions that we can use? So what about the more general case of combinatorial auctions, which bidders are not single-minded, but instead they are what's called multi-minded. So multi-minded bidder might desire several different bundles and might even have different values for different bundles that player can receive. So this is a more general case. So in 2003, Lavi, Mualem, and Nisan, from here on I'll call them LMN because I'm going to be using them a lot. So they look at this case of combinatorial auctions with multi-minded players. And this is still not a completely general valuation functions because we're still assuming the free disposal and non-externalities, which don't hold in Roberts' theorem. So LMN's theorem is, they show that if we restrict the valuations of the combinatorial auction, then all of the implementable solutions are affine maximizers. Essentially, Roberts' theorem holds for the case of combinatorial auctions even with the restrictions. So the restrictions aren't going to help us find things that are non-affine. And they actually, along the way of proving that theorem, they proved a much stronger theorem, which they call their main theorem, and this is as follows. Every social choice function, so every way of choosing how to allocate the goods, with the following 5 restrictions. They have a list of restrictions that I'll go into later. So it has to be an order-based domain, it has to have conflicting preferences, a non-degenerate range, it has to be player decisive, it has to satisfy a condition they call S-MON, must be an affine maximizer. Now there's an almost there. The almost says that this is true only if the valuation is sufficiently large. So for small valuations, it might be that it doesn't have to be an affine maximizer. They believe that this almost here is not something inherently true, but is an artifact of their proof. And we're going to be carrying around this almost throughout this entire talk. This almost is going to be something we're going to have to carry around and think about throughout the way. So we're sort of going to put that aside. And using this main theorem, they show that for combinatorial auctions, all implementable social choice functions must be almost affine maximizers, simply because they show that combinatorial auctions hold the conditions of this theorem. Now they pose the open question, which they don't answer, what about the double-sided auction? For the double-sided auction, are all implementable social choice functions, must they also be affine maximizers? So that's the open question they pose. So since we're going to be using the LMN's main theorem, we sort of have to understand it. So let's go over the conditions just to understand what they mean. So the first condition is an order-based domain, and a domain is order-based if each valuation if the player's valuations can be expressed as a series of equalities and inequalities. So it's sort of what you would expect. Conflicting preferences means that players' choices can conflict. There can be inherent conflicts between the players. Formally, the way they define this is that each player has a set of top alternatives, or most preferred alternatives that that player can get. And each player has a set of bottom alternatives, which is the set of least preferred alternatives that that player can get. And for every player, there exists one of the top alternatives, which is simultaneously a bottom alternative of all the other players. So we can make one player very happy at the cost of making all of the other players very unhappy. So this is what conflicting preferences means. A non-degenerate range is a sort of generalization of Roberts' demand that there's at least 3 possible outcomes. So non-degenerate range means that for any player which is not the first player, there exists an allocation in which neither the first player nor the player that we're looking at have 0 valuation. So this is sort of generalization. The fourth demand is the player decisiveness, which means that any player can decide the allocation, can achieve what he wants to get if he raises his bid enough. So if a player is willing to pay sufficiently a lot, then that player will be able to get the good. For example, in a dictator game, if you're not the dictator, it's not a player decisive game. No matter how much you raise your price, you will not be able to get the good. Finally, S-MON. And S-MON is a sort of technical demand. And it means that if a single player changes his valuation, and that change in valuation causes the allocation to change, then it must be that that player is more happier in the second allocation than he was in the original allocation. This is sort of technical demand. So going back to our result is we answer LMN's open question, and we show that the social choice functions for any truthful double-sided auction mechanism must be an almost affine maximizer. Again, almost is for sufficiently large values. This is going to be an artifact of LMN's proof. We're going to define some tools along the way. Yes?
Can you give an example of a mechanism which is not affine maximizer?
Sure. The simplest mechanism which is not an affine maximizer is due to Ahuva and Nisan, I think from 2003. So it's a combinatorial auction, single-minded players, and every player wants a bundle of some size. So they look at 2 possibilities. They look at the small bundles for some k, and for that they do an exhaustive search to find the optimal allocation among all possible, the optimal allocation of people who just want small bundles, and they look at the maximal value, the maximal value that the player has for any bundle, and they take a maximum over these 2 possible ways of dividing the goods. That's obviously not affine, because they have a maximum function now.
Is it truthful mechanism?
It's truthful mechanism, yes. It's truthful because because you're single-minded, if you only want a small bundle, or if you want a small bundle which is less than size k, then you're not going to pretend to have a larger bundle, because then you'll have to pay more. And okay, so it's truthful. Do you want me to go into details of why it's truthful, or is it clear? Okay. So this is not an affine maximizer. Of course, it's for a very special case, which is a single-minded combinatorial auction. Yes?
So this isn't really my domain, so this might be a really dumb question, but is it considered good or bad to have an affine optimizer? I mean, are you wanting affine, or are you wanting not affine, or do you care? You're just trying to prove?
Do I want affine or not affine?
What's the implications of saying that it is or it isn't?
The implications are that for general domains, it's hard to find things that are not affine. So don't even you can't do it. So it makes do I want to do it? Not really, but I shouldn't waste my time trying to do it, for example, because I'm not going to be able to do it. So it's simply a characterization. All of these functions must be of the following form.
Okay, which simplifies finding their solution.
Well, from a practical point of view, it simplifies finding solutions. From a theoretical point of view, which we're more concerned about, it enlarges our understanding of how these things have to interact.
If you're not concerned about computational efficiency, so what would be the advantage of any other thing than just applying the VCG mechanism? I mean, compared with the other mechanism.
Well, again, when I'm not concerned with computational efficiency, I don't mind spending a lot of time to find the optimal solution. So indeed, if I were looking for the optimal solution, then I would just do the VCG, because that's known to be optimal. But what I'm trying to see is, what can we find that's not affine? Is there a possible way of doing it which is not going to give us an affine function? And the VCG is affine.
But what is your goal? Your goal is just to find something which is not just a mechanism which is not affine.
Our goal is to say that there is no mechanism which is not affine. It's impossible to find. Our goal is to characterize the space of all mechanisms for this problem. So we're not interested in the optimal solution. We're interested in characterization. Now, as a sub-property, if we are interested in computational complexity, so we don't want to run things for exponentially large time, then we can look at domains that we can still, this still holds, our theorem still holds for problems which are computationally bounded. So we can still look at solutions that are computationally bounded and still have to be affine. So that's not going to really change anything. Is that clear? Or? So it's sort of an orthogonal question. One is, how can we find the best? And second is, what are all the possible solutions which hold these properties, which are basically truthful? Any other questions before we sort of go into the proof?
Are you define double-sided?
Yes, I will define formally double-sided auctions. Okay, so the structure of the proof is, it's a relatively simple proof, it just looks complex. We're going to take Element's theorem. We're going to apply it to a special case of combinatorial auction, which we call the combinatorial auction product space. We're then going to show that the combinatorial auction product space holds Element's conditions, and therefore must all solutions for the combinatorial auction product space must be affine maximizers. We'll then show that this is true also for a special case of the double-sided auction, which is what we call the double-sided auction with cost 0. And finally, we'll show that this is also true for the double-sided auction itself. This is sort of the structure of the proof. Okay, so as asked, I will now define formally what a double-sided auction is. So a double-sided auction has n sellers, and each seller I sells a single good GI. And each seller has a cost for that good, which that seller cost either to produce the good or has a value for that good, which is not willing to give up that good for any value which is less than that cost. There are also buyers. It's a double-sided. We both have sellers and buyers, and each buyer has a non-negative value for each possible good. So each seller has a value for each possible good for each of the buyers. But each buyer only wants a single good. So these goods are substitutes. But of course, the buyer might have different values for different goods. Now, it's double-sided in the sense that both buyers and sellers are going to be strategic. Both buyers and sellers will not necessarily tell the true information, and both the costs of the sellers and the valuations of the buyers are going to be private information. So only the buyer, that relevant player, knows the cost or the value, and nobody else knows it. And our goal is to maximize the gain from trade, or the maximal possible allocation. So, what?
Is that the function that's affine that maybe would
Is
not
the-
be affine?
Is the gain from trade going to be affine?
I mean, is that where you decide whether
Right.
if you wanted something else
Yes.
instead of the gain from trade?
Exactly. That's what we could.
Where
Right.
gain from trade would be non-affine.
So exactly. Right. So that would be a non-affine possibility, is we want to maximize some square thing.
So what's the definition of gain from trade?
Okay. So the gain from trade means in a double-sided market, it's the total gain from. So basically, we're looking for some kind of matching. Now, each possible match of a buyer and a seller has some kind of value associated with it, which is the difference between what the buyer values the good that he received and what the seller valued it. Now, we're trying to maximize that sum. So this is the gain from trade. Okay. So the first problem that we're going to use as an auxiliary problem is the CAPS, the combinatorial auction product space. Now, the intuition of the CAPS is a very, very simple intuition. The intuition says that each player in the CAPS is going to correspond to a possible trade in the double-sided auction, which means, in particular, that the number of players in the CAPS is going to be the number of sellers in the double-sided auction times the number of buyers in the double-sided auction. And each player in the CAPS is going to be indexed with two indexes. One is the buyer that it corresponds to, and one is the seller which it corresponds to. There are going to be goods. There's going to be m plus n goods, which is the number of buyers in the double-sided auction, plus the number of sellers in the double-sided auction. So as I said, each player in the CAPS corresponds to a possible trade. The value of that player is going to be the difference between the buyer in that pair and the seller in that pair. And we're going to, so this of course causes problems, because for any given player in the double-sided auction, for any given buyer, for example, double-sided auction, it can correspond to many different pairs in the CAPS, many different possible pairs, depending on which seller we match it to. So we're going to use the goods in order to assure that this can't happen. So we're going to think of the goods as being indicator variables that if any given pair in the CAPS, which corresponds to a given buyer-seller pair, will desire the goods that one good which corresponds to the buyer in its pair, and one good which corresponds to the seller in its pair. And the value, as I said, is the difference in values. So of course the CAPS is a special case of the combinatorial auction, and we're going to try to maximize social welfare as usual, or some other non-affine function. Okay, so if a player in the CAPS receives the goods, then, well, basically any allocation in the CAPS defines the allocation of double-sided auction and vice versa. Because the value that each player has in the CAPS is going to be the gain from trade if it received both of its goods and 0 otherwise, then if we know which players in the CAPS trade, then we know which pairs in the double-sided auctions trade. And we know, and since we're looking at a special case of the double-sided auction cost 0, where all the costs of the sellers are 0, then we can set the price. So if we solve the double-sided auction, we can find an allocation for the CAPS, which follows from the double-sided auction. And so therefore, if we show that CAPS must be affine, an affine maximizer, then hopefully we're able to show that double-sided auction cost 0 must also be an affine maximizer. But we're going a bit ahead of ourselves, so the first thing, let's show that the CAPS must be an affine maximizer. So I pretty much said how we're going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to use Element's main theorem. So Element had 5 conditions. We're going to show that all of these 5 conditions hold for the special case of the CAPS. So the first one, order-based domain, well, CAPS has real valuations, therefore it's obviously order-based domain. Conflicting preferences. So what does it mean conflicting preferences? It means it has to be every player has one top alternative, one most preferred possibility, which is the least preferred possibility for every other player. Well, if we allocate all of the goods to a particular player in the CAPS, that is a, not the, but it is a most preferred alternative. There are obviously other alternatives which it prefers just as much, but it's only a most preferred one. And it is least preferred one for any other player since they don't receive any trade.
But if you restrict yourself with every player wants only one, as you said, only one item, then you're not, supposedly you're not allowed to give him several items.
Well, every player in the double-sided auction wants one good. But in the CAPS, I didn't restrict myself that way. That's why I'm going to the CAPS, so I don't have to restrict myself. Okay? And now I'm going to show that, that if I have something that's non-affine in the double-sided auction, I can translate to something that's non-affine also in the CAPS. That's going to be the basic idea. So player decisiveness, if a player increases his bid sufficiently large, then obviously that player will win. It's a non-degenerate range, so this is sort of a technical difficulty that we have here because the definition of non-degenerate range says that the first player can be satisfied simultaneously with every other player. Obviously for the CAPS this is not true because the first player consists of a buyer-seller pair and no other player in the CAPS which corresponds to the same buyer or the same seller can be satisfied simultaneously. But again, intuitively, the non-degenerate range part basically means there are many different possibilities of happening. So we can simply add a single additional player who desires a good that nobody else wants, and then since it doesn't interfere with any of the other demands, we can get the non-degenerate range. And finally, the S-MON for CAPS, which means that if a player's change in valuation causes a change in allocation, that player is obviously more happy. This is a sort of technical, difficult details, and we can just go over the 2 different cases and show that this holds in both of the cases. So since LMN holds all of the conditions of the CAPS, since the CAPS hold all of the conditions of LMN, all solutions for the CAPS must be almost affine maximizers. So let's go back to the roadmap so we don't get lost. So basically we've just shown that the CAPS must be almost affine maximizers, and now we want to show this is true for the double-sided auction with cost 0. So the double-sided auction with cost 0 is a special case of the double-sided auction, and what makes it special is that the cost of the sellers are 0. So this makes our life a lot easier because we can define prices very easily between the double-sided auction with cost 0 and the CAPS because the prices are going to be the same and the values are going to be the same. So we're going to extend the standard definition of reduction from computer science to a reduction which conserves truthfulness, and a reduction which also going to conserve the properties of being an affine maximizer. So since we want to show that this is true, that all solutions for double-sided auction cost 0 must be almost affine maximizers, and we know this is true for the CAPS, we'll show that if in a contradiction there's a non-affine maximizer for the double-sided auction with cost 0, we can cause this to get non-affine maximizer for the CAPS. So this is the formal definition of a truth-preserving reduction. The formal definition is not really important. What is important is the intuition. So the intuition says, what is a reduction? A reduction is a means of solving problem B by solving problem A. And what we do is, if we have a black box that can solve problem A, we'll take the input for problem B, translate to input for problem A, and solve it in problem A. A truth-preserving reduction means that if you want it to be truthful, if the optimal strategy for every player in problem A was to be truthful, then the optimal strategy for every player in problem B, when we solve problem B, by translating it to an input for problem A, is also to be truthful. So this is what a truth-preserving reduction means. This is a very interesting concept because we don't really talk about any computational complexity. I'm not saying this reduction is polynomial or not. I really don't care. In our case, they will be polynomial. And since we want to prove a non-affine property, so we show that the non-affine maximizing preserving reduction means what you would expect, that if a function is non-affine for B, it's also going to be non-affine for A. Okay, so first of all, an optimal solution for CAPS is an optimal solution for the double-sided auction cost 0. This is simply because it follows from the definition of the problem. And we're going to show that this reduction is going to be a truth-preserving reduction, and therefore, if it's truthful for CAPS, it's also going to have to be truthful for double-sided auction cost 0. And this is simply follows from the simple definition of how the problems look. But we still have to say that this problem is implementable, which means that we can set prices that would be caused to be truthful. So, well, double-sided auction cost 0, it's relatively easy to set the prices if we know the prices for the CAPS. Why? Well, sellers, we know what their value is. They don't have any private information, so we can just give them 0. Their cost is 0, we can give them 0. There's no question of truthfulness there. Buyers can pay the prices charged by the CAPS. So the CAPS induce prices on the pair, but since the seller part of the pair is 0, then we can simply give the buyer the entire price, which is charged by the CAPS. So finally, we've shown this, the affineness is preserved. So if we have a non-affine maximizing mechanism for double-sided auction cost 0, which is truthful, it's going to induce a non-affine maximizing mechanism for CAPS. But this simply follows from definition of the valuations. Anything can be written as an affine maximizer for double-sided auction cost 0, can be written as an affine maximizer for the CAPS, simply because these problems are symmetrical. So now we've just shown that double-sided auction cost 0 has to have, all solutions for double-sided auction cost 0 must be affine maximizers. Now, we're not really interested in double-sided auction cost 0 per se. We're more interested in the double-sided auction itself, which is the general case. So obviously, the double-sided auction cost 0 is a special case of the double-sided auction, okay? Because it's just a case in which the cost is 0, so it's a special case. But we want to show that it's not really that special. It's a very general case, and all double-sided auctions can be written as a double-sided auction with cost 0. So what is the intuition for this? This is going to be very simple. We're going to take a general double-sided auction, and we want to translate it into a double-sided auction with cost 0. Well, for the buyers, we don't really have any problem, because there's no constraints in the double-sided auction cost 0. We do have problems with the sellers. We have to somehow take a seller who has a non-zero cost and translate it into a seller with a 0 cost. Now, how do we do this? This isn't clear. Well, what we do is the following. We take each seller and replace it with a pair of players, with 2 players. One player is going to be a seller with cost 0, who has the good. The other player is going to be a buyer with the cost of the seller. So any solution for this basically takes any solution for the double-sided auction. It translates it to a double-sided auction cost 0, and an induced solution from a double-sided auction cost 0 with these replaced players, we can use it to find a solution for the double-sided auction. Simply because if the player that corresponds to the buyer part of the seller receives the good, that means that seller should not trade. Otherwise, the seller should trade, and we know to who trades. It trades to some other buyer, and that gives us a definition. So this is almost good, but we still have to define prices. We have to show this is implementable, which means that we have truthful prices.
So just to be sure, I mean, this reduction, I think, it was known before, yeah? I mean, it's not like I know, it appears in this, I think, soda paper of,
I'm not aware of it appearing before, but I'd be surprised if it didn't. So.
Which paper? I think of Anna Carlin, Jason Artline, Claire Kenyon, maybe you or no, not. It was in Stink Soda 2003 or 2004 or something. I mean, some parts of this reduction.
Well, this is very simple reduction. Yeah, this is simply intuitive. I mean, it could have appeared for, that's not the main contribution. It's sort of minor technical.
Something else, but they trying to find some. Also, I mean, they look at the same problem, I think, but they're different goals.
Yeah. I would not be surprised if this is a very natural way to do things. So, I mean, I'll look up the reference, obviously, but it's not really important. So we want to show that this is going to be implementable, so we have to define prices. So defining prices for the buyers is, well, relatively easy. So if the buyer doesn't trade as usual, we can set it to be 0. This is from IR, we have to set it to be 0. If the buyer trades in the optimal solution, then it trades in the induced double-sided auction cost 0. So we can set the prices to be the induced prices from the double-sided auction with cost 0. Now, this works for the buyers, but the sellers is trickier. The reason the sellers is trickier because if a seller trades, then that means that the buyer part of the seller in the double-sided auction cost 0 doesn't trade, which means the double-sided auction cost 0 will give a 0 value, a 0 price for the buyer part of the seller, and obviously it will also give a 0 price for the seller part of the seller. And so we really can't tell what the price should be for the seller in the double-sided auction. So we sort of have to be a bit smarter. And the key observation here is that we've assumed that our sellers are single-minded. Each seller sells a single good. So we can set the prices to be critical values. Since this mechanism is going to be monotonic, and we have critical prices, and we can set the prices to be the critical prices. But in order to do this, we're going to have to generalize the Folk theorem.
So what are these critical prices?
How do they look like?
Yeah, what does it mean?
Okay, so sellers either trade or they don't trade. Now, the lower the monotonicity property says that the more you lower your price as a seller, the more likely you are to trade. Therefore, there's some value, which is the minimal price, which you will trade. And that's the price that's a critical price. Because exactly the border.
What are the others in a given situation?
In a given situation. So it just depends on what the other players do. Actually, we show something slightly more. We show that these critical prices are themselves affine functions. So these are also going to be affine. Now, there's a well-known Folk theorem that says that for any monotonic mechanism for single-minded players, then critical prices will be truthful. It's an if and only if, actually. Now, this mechanism is not single-minded because some of the players are not single-minded and some are. So we have to sort of generalize that Folk theorem to say that for any mechanism for the players which are single-minded, we can set the prices to be critical values, and that will be true. And that's sort of technical and not really hard to do. So the final thing we have to do is we have prices for the buyers, which follows from the double-sided auction cost 0, and we have prices from the sellers, which follow from the critical value. And the question is how these prices relate to each other. So we need to take the prices for the buyers and extend them to take the prices for the sellers. So we have two vectors of prices. Now, neither one of them is by itself truthful, because one of them has 0 for the sellers, and one of them has 0 for the buyers. So neither of them is truthful. But if we we cannot use any of the Goldstacketti lattice-like theorems, but we show that we can take these two price vectors and unify them and get a single price vector, which is truthful both for buyers and for sellers. And so this is what we call an extension of prices. And so therefore, since we can use this reduction to show that if we have a non-affine maximizer for the double-sided auction, we can calculate a non-affine maximizer for the double-sided auction cost 0 in contradiction to what we showed before. So in summary, we've introduced the concept of truth-preserving reduction, which is a way of reducing problems which depends purely and solely on their mechanism design problems without any relationship to the computational difficulty of solving them, but only on their inherent problems of how they look from a mechanism design perspective. And we use this concept to show that for the double-sided auction, all the truthful mechanisms must be almost affine maximizers. So there are two kinds of open questions. The first open question are the open questions posed by LMN, which we really didn't answer. We basically took one of the open questions and answered it. But they have other open questions about different domains and other kinds of open questions. But an open question I find very interesting is, well, our proof technique utilized a new kind of idea, this new kind of reduction. Now, when we had in computer science, we had computational reductions. We could use this to define computational classes. Now, can we do something similar for mechanism design problems? Can we say that some mechanism design problems are inherently more difficult than others? Not from the computational point of view, but from the point of view of the restrictions that these problems have in order to induce truthfulness. I mean, is this the right definition? Is the definition that we've used? Is it the right definition to define such a hierarchy, if it is possible to define such a hierarchy? I don't know, but I think it's something that's worth thinking about. And that's it. Those are my questions.
And so regarding maybe not specifically for this particular work, but maybe more in general, but maybe you can comment on it. So here, for example, you had a truthful mechanism in which you pay the sellers 0, and hence they have no incentive to lie, but they also have no incentive to tell the truth. So, kind of, in a sense, it satisfies maybe some formal definition of truthfulness, but maybe not some intuitive definition of truthfulness.
Okay, so the formal definitions that we use, there are two kinds of. The formal definition is definition of dominant strategies. That this is the best possible strategy that you can do, and since in this case we know what their values are, we don't have to really care about them. Now, dominant strategies means that this is something you should do no matter what anybody else does. This is going to be the optimal solution for you. And dominant strategies comes in two flavors. The first flavor is weak dominant strategies. That it could be the other strategies that you could use that are just as good, but they're not better. So basically we're saying you should do this, and you have no incentive, you have no reason not to do what we tell you to do. That's the weak kind of definition. The other definition is what's called strong dominant strategies, which as you would assume means that this is the optimal best, and the inequality is a strong inequality. So yes, this would be weak dominant strategies, not strong dominant strategies, but since we know their values, we don't really care. But obviously,
just saying that in this context, kind of weak might be too weak because as a seller, I just go home. That's it. Well, you promise me to begin with, no matter what I do, I get 0.
But in this context, you can't go home because we know where you live. We know what your value is. So we know, we can force you. But yeah.
Thank you.
לא כל ענות גבורה, לא כל ענות חלושה.